At the turn of the 19th century, the frontier around Parramatta, the George River and Prospect in New South Wales was no longer a thin edge, but a grinding contact zone where farms, stock huts and government orders pressed against Aboriginal movement and law. After years of raids, reprisals, hunger and fear, settlers began to treat every track in the scrub as a threat. For local Aboriginal groups, the spread of fences and patrols meant shrinking country, shrinking food, and growing punishment. The background to the year 1801 was a decade of escalation that taught both sides hard lessons. Settlers learned that isolated farms could be struck and then abandoned to the bush. Aboriginal fighters learned that muskets, mounted pursuit, and collective punishments could arrive fast, even when no single battle was declared. In this landscape, violence did not need a formal campaign name. It arrived as a response to rumor, a missing animal, a broken fence, or a shot fired at dusk. In colonial administration, Parramatta and its corridors mattered because they fed and anchored the inland settlement system. Roads, granaries, and outstations were not just infrastructure, they were an assertion that the colony was permanent. Yet permanence required security, and security demanded rules about how soldiers and settlers were allowed to use force. By the early months of 1801, the push for clearer, harsher rules grew louder, driven by nervous communities who wanted the government to do something that felt final. Governor Philip Gidley King stood at the center of that pressure, responsible for protecting settlers while maintaining the colony's authority in public view. His problem was that the frontier could not be policed like a town street. The bush absorbed patrols, and fear multiplied faster than official reports. When settlers demanded stronger action, they were demanding permission as much as protection. The governor's decisions, therefore, became a signal to everyone, soldier, settler, and Aboriginal family, about what behavior would be tolerated. This is where the milestone of 1801 matters, even without a named battle. Sources describe orders and directions that amounted to driving Aboriginal people away from settlements with fire, meaning by gunfire rather than by negotiation or mere warning. In practice, such language legitimized a harder line. The threshold for pulling a trigger moved lower, and the act of forcing distance became a routine duty rather than an extraordinary measure requiring immediate justification. On the ground around Prospect and the George River, "drive off with fire" was not an abstract phrase. It meant armed men standing at boundaries where water, fishing spots, and travel paths met cleared fields. It meant shots used to scatter groups before any alleged theft occurred. It meant that the frontier's daily rhythm changed because approaching a farm could now be treated as enough cause for violence. The policy did not create fear from nothing, but it sharpened fear into procedure. For Aboriginal groups continuing resistance after earlier leaders and earlier clashes, the order reshaped tactics. If proximity to a settlement could be answered with gunfire, movement had to become more cautious, routes more indirect, and raids more selective. But caution also carried a cost. Detours meant less access to resources, less ability to observe, and more exposure to patrols that controlled open ground. The colony's harshness aimed to disrupt cohesion, yet it could also deepen grievance by proving that the government's answer was force, not consent. For settlers, the same order offered emotional relief and moral danger at once. Relief, because it sounded like a promise of control, a permission slip to act first and ask questions later. Danger, because routine violence corrodes discipline, and discipline was already fragile on scattered farms staffed by anxious men. When gunfire becomes a tool for keeping distance, the boundary between defense and retaliation blurs, a warning shot can become an injury. An injury can become revenge. Revenge can become the next raid, and the cycle tightens. The escalation of 1801 therefore reads like a hinge in documentary terms. Not a single clash, but a shift in the colony's rules of engagement along the Parramatta districts. It marks the point where coercion was framed as policy rather than improvisation. It also shows how frontier governance worked. Proclamations and orders travelled down to local hands, and in those hands they became lived reality. Decisions made in seconds, with muskets, across a few steps of contested ground. Part 1 ends with the key contradiction of the year 1801. The government sought safety by authorizing harsher force, yet harsh force could not create agreement. Only distance, fear, and temporary quiet. Around Parramatta, Prospect, and the George River, that quiet was unstable because it rested on the threat of gunfire. In Part 2, we will follow how this directive interacted with patrol routines, settler behaviour, and Aboriginal adaptation in the same corridor of conflict. In the months after the year 1801 began, the order to drive off with fire did not remain in the governor's office as a neat phrase. It spread into the habits of patrols and the expectations of settlers living beyond the town's streets, where a fence line could be the only border between a farm and the bush. Around Parramatta, Prospect, and the George River, the frontier was already tense. The new directive made that tension procedural. It taught armed men that warning could mean gunfire, and that distance could be enforced without negotiation. Patrol routines changed first, because patrols were the colony's visible hand. Soldiers and constables moved along tracks connecting farms, river crossings, and outstations. Their presence was meant to deter raids and reassure settlers. Under a harsher rule, deterrence leaned less on arrest and more on intimidation. A patrol did not need to catch someone with stolen goods to feel it had done its job. If it could push Aboriginal people away from a settlement zone by firing shots, it could claim it had prevented danger before it happened. This prevention logic mattered because the settlement feared surprise. Frontier violence was rarely announced. It arrived as a raid on livestock, a theft of tools, or a clash during pursuit. Settlers therefore demanded that the government treat presence itself as threat. The fire directive matched that desire. It said, in effect, that proximity to colonial space could be treated as hostile intent. In practice, this collapsed the time for judgment. Instead of asking who was there and why, armed men were encouraged to decide quickly and with force. For Aboriginal families, the immediate consequence was displacement from everyday roots. The lands around Parramatta and Prospect were not empty corridors. They were woven with paths to water, fishing spots, and seasonal foods. When gunfire became an accepted method of pushing people away, those routes became dangerous. A family moving near a farm could be scattered before any words were exchanged. That danger did not remove the need for food or movement. It forced people to choose between risk and hunger, between visibility and survival. The directive also intensified the psychological war. Gunfire used as warning creates a constant background threat, and constant threat erodes trust. Settlers began to read any movement as scouting. Aboriginal groups began to read any patrol as a hunt. Rumours multiplied because fear multiplies stories. A distant shot could be told as an attempted murder. An animal missing from a yard could be told as a proof of an organised attack. Each rumour justified the next patrol, and each patrol justified the next raid in the minds of those being pushed out. Yet enforcement was uneven, because the frontier was uneven. Some officers aimed for restraint, worrying that uncontrolled shooting would provoke wider resistance and stain the government's legitimacy. Others were eager to show results, and results were easiest to claim when violence was visible. Settlers, too, were not a single bloc. Some wanted strict control, others feared that harsher measures would bring harsher reprisals. The directive did not eliminate debate. It shifted the balance so that the harsh option could be defended as obedience to policy. Along the Georges River, where bush and water offered concealment, the drive-off approach often meant firing into cover rather than into a clearly identified target. That practice magnified danger for non-combatants because a musket ball does not distinguish between a fighter and a family member. It also magnified resentment because it framed Aboriginal presence as inherently unlawful. For Aboriginal groups, this was not merely a security measure. It was a message that the colony claimed the right to define who could exist near settlements and under what conditions. Resistance adapted under this pressure. If approaching a farm risked immediate gunfire, then timing and surprise became even more valuable. Instead of lingering near settlements, raiders could strike quickly at the edge, seize what was needed, and vanish into gullies and river bends before a patrol could form. At the same time, some groups might choose avoidance over raids, moving farther from the most dangerous zones. Both choices carried costs. Avoidance meant losing access to country and resources. Raids meant increased punishment and pursuit. The directive also hardened settler masculinity and community identity around weapons. A firearm became not only a tool for defense, but a badge of readiness. Men kept muskets closer, slept lighter, and formed armed parties more readily. This readiness could prevent some attacks, but it also increased the frequency of accidental escalation. A misread movement in the dusk could trigger a shot. A shot could trigger retaliation. Retaliation could trigger a sweeping patrol. The frontier became a place where small sparks could ignite large responses because the default posture was now armed suspicion. Part 2 ends with a clear documentary insight. The year 1801 did not introduce violence to the Parramatta districts, but it institutionalized a particular kind of violence, making gunfire a routine instrument of boundary making. That choice tightened the cycle it aimed to break, because it could not remove the underlying conflict over land and movement. In Part 3, we will track how this hardening policy played into the colony's broader strategy of deterrence, punishment, and public messaging, and how Aboriginal resistance narratives persisted despite the attempt to silence them with force. The story moves from the governor's directive into paddocks and river bends, where the order issued in the year 1801 became daily behaviour. Around Parramatta, Prospect, and along the Georges River, settlers did not experience policy as paragraphs. They experienced it as patrol boots, loaded muskets, and shots fired to push people back. A frontier line was drawn not with ink, but with sound, smoke, and fear. Patrols began to treat distance itself as the objective. Instead of approaching to question, they approached to clear ground, using gunfire as warning and proof of action. The message to settlers was reassurance that the government existed beyond the town's edge. The message to Aboriginal families was colder. Being near farms could be punished instantly, even without a raid, even without theft, even without a spoken demand. The geography made this approach both tempting and dangerous. Near cleared fields, a patrol could see farther, move faster, and feel dominant. But a few steps into scrub, gullies, and river timber changed everything. Visibility collapsed, tracks vanished, and muskets became clumsy in tight cover. Gunfire used to drive off could scatter families, yet it could also invite counterattack because the bush favoured those who knew every bend. Settler life hardened in response. Watches lengthened, stockyards were checked more often, and men moved between farms with weapons ready. Anxiety became routine, and routine made overreaction easier. A shadow near a fence could be read as a scouting party. A distant call in the timber could be read as a raid forming. Under an aggressive rule, fear did not stay private. Fear became justification, and justification became a reason to shoot first. For Aboriginal groups, the order squeezed everyday movement into narrower and riskier corridors. Water access, fishing places, and pathways between kin groups could now be treated as threats to settlement safety. If approaching a farm meant gunfire, survival demanded new timing and new routes. Some chose avoidance, moving farther from the most dangerous clearings. Others chose sharper raids, striking quickly at food and tools, then withdrawing before patrols could assemble. The colony often interpreted both choices through the same lens. Hostility. Avoidance was read as lurking, raids were read as criminality, and the harsher line encouraged officials to collapse these distinctions. That collapse mattered because it widened punishment. A patrol could claim it was preventing attack even when it was merely enforcing exclusion, and exclusion expanded conflict because it denied neutral presence and turned more encounters into confrontations. The most violent moments frequently came from confusion, not planning. A patrol would fire to scare, a ball would strike, a wounded body would demand revenge. Settlers sometimes acted beyond orders, while soldiers sometimes followed the harshest interpretation to avoid blame later. This blurred responsibility. Aboriginal people could not separate state violence from private violence, and settlers could point to policy even when acting on anger and panic. Resistance leadership also shifted under pressure. The government wanted names to punish because names made the problem look containable. Aboriginal resistance was not a single chain of command, yet it could concentrate around respected fighters and organizers. When policy turned harsher, leadership needed to be more mobile and less visible, relying on small groups, quick decisions, and routes that avoided predictable crossings. The struggle became less about holding ground and more about denying the colony the comfort of safety. In the settlements, officials tried to present escalation as order. They spoke of protecting farms, keeping roads open, and preventing attacks. But the same measures that protected some sites inflamed the wider district. Each patrol reminded Aboriginal families that expansion was backed by guns, not consent. Each shot fired as warning trained both sides to expect violence at first contact, turning ordinary proximity into a trigger. The key conclusion of the year 1801 is that drive off with fire did not simply answer conflict. It reorganized daily life around conflict. It turned presence into provocation and distance into policy, forcing Aboriginal groups to adapt and settlers to harden. That transformation fed a cycle in which attempts to secure stability through harsher force produced more fear, more retaliation, and a deeper, longer frontier war. In the months after the order in the year 1801, the district around Parramatta, Prospect, and the George River began to feel like a controlled zone rather than a growing settlement. Patrols were scheduled, routes were repeated, and clearing became a measure of success. Shots were fired, less as last resort and more as routine signal, a warning, a threat, and a demonstration that the governor's line would be carried into fields and timber by armed men. Governor Philip Gidley King's authority mattered because it set expectations for everyone beneath him. When a governor's stance is understood as permission to use fire to push people away, lower officers and settlers often interpret that permission broadly. The rule does not stay narrow. It spreads into habits. A patrol that fires once without consequence learns it can fire again. A settler who hears shots near his fence feels protected and demands more of the same. The policy also changed the meaning of ordinary Aboriginal presence. Being near a farm could be treated as intent, and intent could be treated as guilt. That logic made escalation easy. A patrol sees figures at distance, fires to drive off, the figures run, the patrol claims success, and the cycle repeats until someone is hit. When blood appears, it becomes proof for one side and grievance for the other, and a warning turns into a reason for revenge. Along the river corridors, Aboriginal groups adapted with the same realism that had shaped earlier resistance. If open approach brought gunfire, movement shifted to hours of darkness, deeper cover, and routes that avoided predictable crossings. Small groups became more common than large gatherings, because large gatherings were easier to spot and easier to punish. Raids, when they happened, aimed at speed and necessity, food, tools, livestock, then a withdrawal that relied on terrain knowledge the settlement could not replicate. Colonial patrols answered adaptation with more patrols, and that response carried its own weakness. More patrols meant more fatigue, more fear, and more moments when judgment slipped. Men who walk day after day through scrub begin to fire faster, because patience feels dangerous. They also begin to mistake silence for ambush. The frontier then becomes a machine that converts uncertainty into violence, a snapped branch, a distant call, a footprint, and suddenly musket smoke. The district settlers learned to live inside that machine. Some welcomed it because it promised safety. Others feared it because it promised retaliation. Farms were isolated, and isolation amplified rumor. A raid on one property made neighbors expect raids on all. When fear spreads, communities demand harsher measures, and harsher measures spread fear again. The result was a settlement psychology that treated coexistence as naive and treated restraint as weakness, even when restraint could have prevented further bloodshed. For Aboriginal families, the pressure was not only military but demographic and material. Disease and displacement reduced numbers and disrupted food access. The harsher line added another burden: less room to move safely, less room to gather resources, and more risk near water and cleared land. Resistance, therefore, became as much about survival as about message. Continuing to strike at key sites showed that the settlement could not fully secure itself, yet every strike also risked brutal reprisals under the new approach. Names still mattered, even when the struggle was broader than any one leader. Pemulwuy had become the best-known symbol of refusal in the late 1790s. And even as the frontier moved into the early 1800s, officials and settlers continued to speak as if removing key figures could solve the problem. But resistance did not depend on a single voice. It depended on shared grievance, kin networks, and local knowledge. New organizers and fighting groups could emerge where older ones were hunted. The governor's harder line also shaped the colony's record-keeping and self-justification. Official language could describe gunfire as driving off, dispersing, or preventing attacks, framing violence as protection rather than aggression. That framing helped officials defend policy, but it also erased Aboriginal reality. Being shot at for approaching one's own country is not dispersion, it is coercion. When a government normalizes coercion, it trains everyone to expect it, and the frontier becomes harder to calm even when leaders want quiet. By the end of the year, 1801, the most important change was structural. The frontier was no longer only reacting to raids, it was preemptively enforcing separation with gunfire. That made the district more tense, not less. Settlers gained short-term confidence, but lived under long-term dread. Aboriginal groups lost space, but sharpened tactics for movement and survival. A policy meant to impose order instead deepened the war's logic, ensuring that the next years would bring continued clashes, harsher patrols, and more enduring memory of violence. The escalation associated with the year 1801 is remembered not because it was a single battle, but because it marked a turning point in how power was applied on the Parramatta and George River frontier. When driving off with fire became accepted practice, violence shifted from reactive to routine. It did not wait for a raid, it tried to prevent presence. That change mattered because it recast everyday movement into a punishable act and made conflict a default condition. Governor Philip Gidley King's role is central because a governor defines what subordinates believe they are allowed to do. Once a hard line is understood as authorized, enforcement spreads downward and outward. Soldiers interpret it as a standing instruction, constables treat it as policy, and settlers imitate it as self-defense. The result is a wider field of armed action with fewer breaks, because the moral and legal hesitation that might restrain a trigger is replaced by the feeling that the trigger serves order. On the ground, the policy's logic produced a predictable chain. Patrols fire to disperse, people flee, patrols claim success, and the district feels briefly safer. But every dispersal creates resentment and a desire to answer humiliation. When retaliation comes, it is then used to justify stronger dispersals. In this loop, neither side experiences itself as the aggressor. Settlers believe they are preventing attacks. Aboriginal groups believe they are defending life and country from force-backed dispossession. The loop is the story. The frontier's geography ensured the loop could not be sealed. Clearings, farms, and roads could be patrolled, but the spaces between them, scrub, gullies, timber, river bends, remained difficult to control. A musket can dominate a fence line, yet it cannot dominate an entire landscape without endless manpower. This meant the colony could never fully guarantee safety while expanding, and Aboriginal groups could never fully avoid contact while being pushed from resources. Escalation therefore persisted because the environment made final control impossible. Resistance after the late 1790s did not vanish. It adapted. Even when specific leaders were hunted, the underlying pressures, lost access, punishment, hunger, and displacement, remained. Groups adjusted routes, timed movements, and selected targets that exploited colonial dependence on food sites and vulnerable travel corridors. Survival itself became strategy. The fact that earlier resistance could continue after arrests and injuries taught later fighters that the colony system had limits, and those limits could be tested again. For settlers, the new normal brought psychological costs. Constant watchfulness made communities quicker to panic and quicker to punish. Rumor became intelligence, and suspicion became policy at the household level. In such conditions, violence can become self-perpetuating. Fear produces harsh actions produce retaliation. Retaliation confirms fear. The frontier then hardens into identity. People come to see themselves as living in a permanent war zone, and that self-image shapes every decision. For Aboriginal families, the cost was lived in narrowed movement, heightened risk at water and food sites, and the ever-present possibility of gunfire even without confrontation. Dispersal by fire was not only physical, it was social. It pressured kin networks, disrupted seasonal routines, and forced choices between staying near essential resources and risking attack. Under those conditions, resistance can become both more desperate and more disciplined, because every mistake can be fatal. The episode also shows how colonial authority relied on narrative as much as muskets. Officials could describe gunfire as prevention and protection, presenting themselves as guardians of order. That language helped justify policy to settlers and to distant authorities. Yet it also concealed what the policy did. It made coercion ordinary. When coercion becomes ordinary, peace requires not only stopping raids, but undoing the assumption that force is the first tool of governance. In documentary terms, the year 1801 stands as a hinge between phases. Earlier years featured raids and pursuit as dramatic events. Now the frontier's violence becomes procedural. This does not create a clear ending. It creates a long middle, years in which clashes, patrols, and reprisals form a rhythm. The significance is therefore cumulative. Each dispersal may be small, but together they reshape the district's expectations and deepen the frontier war's roots. The enduring conclusion is stark. The policy to push Aboriginal people away with gunfire did not solve insecurity. It institutionalized it. It signaled that settlement expansion would be enforced by weapons, and it taught Aboriginal groups that survival demanded adaptation under fire. In that sense, the year 1801 is remembered as a milestone of escalation, a moment when the colony chose a harsher language and the frontier answered with longer conflict, harder boundaries, and a legacy that cannot be reduced to one battle.